Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this second discussion. And we're going to be concentrating on HR policies and what the first steps are in relation to harassment in the workplace. So basically, HR is the first line of defense before we get to, lodging a complaint with the police or taking legal action. So we really wanted to get into it and get your insights on it so that we can tell everyone who's tuned in what steps they need to take. So first off, we've got Gayani Ranasinghe. She is Dignity at Work advocate and an attorney at law and also an HR consultant. Hi, Gayani. Welcome.
Hi.
Also, Dharini Priscilla joining us again. She was on with us for the first discussion. She is a project manager at the Grassrooted Trust. Hi. And then, of course, we've got Mrs. Simran Singh. Hello, good morning. She is the country director, ILO country office for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And of course, Blessy.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good morning. It's great to have all of you. There was something that I saw on social media which really bothered me. And, of course, with all the recent, comings out of women in the media, as well as a range of other places now talking about sexual harassment at the workplace, so much so that we here at Women in Media thought it was important for us to talk about those important aspects of not staying silent, what we can do, realizing that we do have a voice, and by starting even small, we can make an impact. We can turn things around, even if it is perhaps only going to be seen in the next generation to come. But this is something I saw. It said women have resorted to social media campaigns of shaming without naming, since institutional and legal structures and processes have failed them. And each of you represent very important pillars of some of the change that can take place from the HR perspective, the International Labor Organization, the work that you do, and of course at the Grassrooted Trust, working with women and corporations both, not just women, but victims in general. Dinasha and I have been working in media for a long time now, and we've done both media as well as, stints in corporate. So we kind of know what it can be, but the importance of HR and policy and holding workplaces accountable is something that we need to explore, and how as employees, as freelancers, as women, what we could do.
Yeah, so we wanted to maybe kick it off with how we can make HR more effective when it comes to making a complaint. The first steps.
So it's important to understand that every individual who's employed has a different social, economic, education, etc. background. And whether we are ready to accept it or not, they bring their learned behavior, their perceptions, attitudes, and their biases to work. They bring them every day to work. So to alter an employee's attitude and perception regarding sexual harassment or violence and harassment in general, it takes time. And a policy alone is not sufficient. So how do we really alter or make an employee unlearn behavior that is ingrained in them? So for that, what we have to do as corporates is we need to build an ecosystem that encourages and supports them in this journey. So this ecosystem has several elements. One, of course, is having a policy, but I'm not going to go into details of like what components need to be there in the policy, but I will give like an overall intro to some of the good practices that we should have. So when we are building the ecosystem, you need to take into account operational realities specific to your organization. For example, do you have a high LTO, or what are your education levels are? Because those are important for you to make your training material, to make your policies, your reporting methods, investigation methods, so on and so forth, right? So you need to take into account your own operational realities. So the ecosystem primarily consists of who are your contact points that deal with reporting, meaning who are the people that employees can go to and report a complaint. So most companies have HR, and they have HR as certain representatives in HR to whom you can go and complain to. But it's also important to look at cross-functional teams in the organization. And it doesn't necessarily have to be only from HR. You also need to look into gender representatives as well. So some companies have a tendency to have only male contact persons or only female. Not having a binary like that, male or female, but having a mix of all genders. So that people feel more included and that we can approach. The other is to make sure that that this is not seen as an HR problem, that this is seen as a work problem, a productivity issue at the workplace.
Right.
So that's why you have cross-functional teams, right? So there's people from different teams that you can go and tell your complaint. So in this way, the people that you have as contact persons can have to be people who are respected at work, and and that you feel that you're comfortable to go and talk to them, and there is no biases involved. Like, for example, if the reporting person is the is a good friend of the person whom against you're complaining, then this is not the correct contact point for you to go and report the complaint. So having a variety of cross-functional teams is one way of ensuring that your reporting mechanism is fair, it's accessible, and it's unbiased. So it's just not only HR. That I like to point out.
Right.
Sani, can I ask? So, in one of those instances that you just mentioned, to go and make your complaint, what if that person is actually a close friend of the person you are complaining about? Then, what is your next step if that is the company, structure?
So I think that's why we say several contact persons. So it's just not one person that you go and report to. It's cross-functional teams, and you have several, like 5, 6, 7 of them, who you can approach. So once you have a panel like that to whom you can pick, no, I am more comfortable with X, and X has no relationship with the person, the respondent or the alleged perpetrator, then I will go and speak with X. So that is one way you overcome this, by having cross-functional teams and allowing people to pick the person whom they are going to go and make this complaint to. Of course, this would also mean that you need to give them proper training, how to be empathetic, how to ensure confidentiality. There's a whole bucket of trainings that goes along with it. And then how do you help that person to unpack the behavior that happened? How is that in terms of the policy of the company? What are the next steps available for the complainant? And which steps would they prefer to take? So all of this has to be guided. And the person whom you're approaching needs to know how to guide the complainant. Also, the services that are available, the support services like counseling, or would you like time off? So all of this has to be firstly trained to the contact person to have these kind of conversations, and helping the complainant to kind of navigate. So these are my options. This is what can happen. This is how the investigation process looks like, and also other forms of support services that are available. So it's just not simply picking people and saying you're a contact person. There's more to it than that, but that's a start.
And also there needs to be gender representation, right? There has to be a female in that list of your support system, because a company that I worked for previously, everyone that you had to go complain to was male. And they did not understand certain aspects of harassment. To them, it just didn't seem like it was harassment, right? Because and also for the victim, you would only feel maybe at most times you would feel more comfortable talking to a female.
Correct. But I also like to broaden this and say gender representatives. because we have a tendency to always think as male and female, but there are other gender representatives as well. So in your company, if you're a more progressive and inclusive company, ensuring that there are all, gender representation has to be there. That is given. And the other is, uh, it's not about what the contact person feels the incident is about. It's really about the impact that behavior had on the complainant, not the intent of the alleged perpetrator or the respondent, right? What's
Exactly.
important is the impact it has on the complainant. So when you're a contact person and you're listening, you're not putting your personal judgment and saying things like, oh, but that's how X behaves all the time. Don't take it personally, right? So those have to be taken out, because what's important here is the impact it has on the complainant, and not how the contact person perceives it, how witnesses perceive it, nothing like that. So that's important to differentiate.
Yes, very important.
Gayani covered it perfectly.
Okay.
It was very thorough. And I do agree representation is very important. And I think in terms of representation, we also need to think a little bit about ethnic representation as well, because those dimensions, those identities come into play when you're either a victim or a perpetrator, right? Something that I noted in terms of a very practical issue with complaining is the accessibility of HR, either in terms of, the lack of options. Like I was saying, it can't be one person, it can't be one way. You need to have multiple options. But also something really interesting we found when we were working with certain groups was that the location, literally the physical location of HR, or where you have to go when you have to go make a physical complaint, played a role into whether or not people made a complaint, reported an incident. Because one institution, one of the victims said, I don't want to go because I have to go through this particular corridor where it's very crowded. So if I go through that corridor, people know I'm going to HR. And therefore they will assume I'm going to talk about something, and therefore people will start spreading rumors. So these are like concerns we don't even realize, right? But for a person who needs to make a complaint, that's a very important factor. Accessibility without going into the place itself is a struggle. And also accessibility in terms of language, because it's very, I often don't see a lot of the policies translated into the local languages. And even when they are, there is an issue with employees, when we ask, do you have a policy? It's yes. But when we ask, do you know what is in the policy? It's always don't harass other people. The basic stuff. Or it's, they don't know where to find it. They think it's a physical, like a booklet or something. But in most companies, especially in the private sector, you can access them through their intranet or some sort of network that they use. But a lot of people are not aware of it. So I think in terms of, like Gayani was saying, it's not just about having a policy, it's about having a holistic approach, an ecosystem that helps put employees, put the policy into practice. And that's why we need trainings, we need sensitization, we need actual effort where we make sure, okay, this is what the policy says, and this is why you need to practice it, and this is what happens when you don't practice it, to you, to your employee, or to your colleagues, and to the company as a whole. Because that understanding is what is missing. Because what is in the policy, we all already know that. We already know we shouldn't harass other people. We already know harassing is wrong, that it makes other people comfortable. But what we don't understand is the impact it has on people and the company as a whole. So those are things that need to be translated better. And those definitely need to be a priority. And I know that it's not really feasible for everyone in terms of doing trainings, in terms of doing sensitization, especially with COVID. But I do feel to create a holistic and a safe, dignified workspace, having a policy is never enough. It needs to be translated properly, or else it's just another piece of paper.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Ms. Simran Singh of the ILO, what global standard has been set up for companies in general that countries have subscribed to and implemented? And how close are we to having some of those global standards implemented here or adopted in Sri Lanka in general?
Right, thanks, Blessy. Yes, okay. Before I get to that, actually, I just wanted to compliment what Gayani and Tharani have said to widen the scope, because the conversation so far has been about a company and an employee. And the world of work has changed dramatically. And the traditional definition of what an employee is by national law and practice has expanded in a way which might not even be featured in terms of law. We have many companies that actually contract out services. You have enterprises that basically have people that are apprentices or interns, etc. there. You have volunteers at the workplace. You even have people that are, for example, job seekers and job applicants, and those that have been retirees or those that have been terminated from their contracts. So basically, and then you of course have the employer as well. It's not just about employees, also those that are employing them that have a management responsibility. So I think we need to look at this more holistically in terms of whatever policies and practice and systems we have, so that we don't exclude all of these other parts of the world of work, and employees, employers, volunteers, interns, you name it, because we do find that that often happens. And maybe even to take it a step further in terms of contractors, because, and I think in the context of Sri Lanka, perhaps this could also make a lot of sense. We've heard a lot about harassment in public transport or in transport services as well, disproportionately affecting women. And across the world, we have found that often when companies provide transport, whether for a conference or just regular transport for employees, there is a very high risk also of harassment happening. And there are oftentimes not straightforward measures or policies in place on how that can be dealt with. So service providers, et cetera, to employers or employees or contractors, I think it's good to also look at expanding the scope. So now on to your other question on what standards there are. So the International Labour Organization is like 102 years old now, and we are a standard setting organization. And we have, I mean, there's a very recent 2-year-old new standard or treaty on violence and harassment in the world of work. But even prior to that passage, and I'll talk about that a bit later, we have enshrined what we call fundamental principles and rights at work. And there are two very key aspects here. One is on non-discrimination, and then other is on equality. There's also a fundamental principle on occupational safety and health. And all of these have basically provided a framework to look at it from a health and occupational safety perspective, to look at it from a non-discrimination, promotion of gender equality perspective in terms of dealing with violence and harassment. But the idea was that the world of work has changed so much. Work is happening virtually, as we're seeing now, also even more so in the COVID context. There are forms of violence and harassment that take place online, bullying, harassment, but also it's not the traditional physical going into an office and harassment way of working. It's also acknowledges the fact that it's not just women, but also men can be subject to violence and harassment, as can persons with disabilities, ethnicities, all of the things that Parani also segments that she mentioned right now. So this standard was adopted 2 years ago after quite a lot of debate between governments that are member states. We have 186 plus member states in the ILO governments, but also representatives of employers and representatives of employees. So when we look at all of these standards and their practical implementation thereafter, it's one thing to ratify a standard, but then to apply it, it's really, really essential that we have the buy-in of not just a government, that has, of course, responsibilities in terms of enforcing law, enacting law, regulatory frameworks, etc., but also very much those that represent employers and those that represent employees, because they have to take this forward and implement this. So this was very much agreed to after a lot of negotiations. And you can imagine how difficult it was, because you had negotiations happening from countries like Somalia to the Netherlands. And of course, the situation and progress on many of these issues are quite diverse, depending on which country and what cultural context also you might be coming from. But this was agreed to, the standard, and is quite far-reaching in its outreach, including the protection of precisely these groups that I mentioned earlier on, those in training, interns, volunteers, contractors, job seekers, as well as, of course, workers and employers themselves. And so that is quite far-reaching. And this instrument actually has not been ratified yet by Sri Lanka. It's been ratified. It came into force just in June last month. It takes 2 years after the passage of a convention or a standard to come into force. So it's come into force. 6, 7 countries around the world have ratified it. None so far from Asia, except for Fiji, which technically falls in the Pacific, and that's a very recent ratification, and Uruguay and stuff. So it's something that there's a lot of movement actually within the human rights, the gender equality communities that are trying to push member states to go ahead and ratify and take where action is. And there has been quite a bit of movement actually in Sri Lanka, which I'm very pleased about, but I'll stop right here and over to other panelists.
Can we hold the company accountable for, breeding this toxic work environment, and what does that look like?
Sure. So there are always two parties when we talk about culture, right? You have the management and you have the employees. And the culture of an organization rests on both of these parties playing their roles. So if you take the management has certain roles to fulfill, having anti-violence and harassment policy, how do you report, investigation process, disciplinary process, training, remedial action, or counseling services, support services, all of this bucket falls really on the management. And the management is also responsible for modeling and creating an environment that allows employees to practice good behavior. So this is really the full bucket of responsibilities when it comes to the management. But similarly, for all of this to function effectively, you need the employees also to do their part. So because you need both hands to clap. So similarly, the employees also have a role to play. So when you ask about things like what do you consider as toxic behaviors, or what's a toxic environment, right? So generally, in an umbrella way of defining violence and harassment, we say they are unacceptable behavior and practices, right? So what do we mean by this unacceptable? There are many definitions and we kind of can break it down, but to make it very easy for people to understand, if you take something like bullying, bullying is repetitive and it's generally directed towards people with a lot of negative criticism, maybe also like giving you a workload which you know that person doesn't have the capacity to do, also sabotaging someone's work, like destroying documents, or giving extremely tight deadlines knowing that person can't do it, or when that person has applied for leave, you go on add on more work. Like these are really types of bullying behavior. So I'm just giving you examples so you know what does a toxic environment kind of look like. Similarly, if you take sexual harassment, there are definitions for it. We generally say sexual harassment can be broken into two components. So that's a quid pro quo sexual harassment and a hostile working environment. What we mean by quid pro quo, it's a Latin term, meaning roughly translated, it means this for that. So I'll extend your contract, I'll give you a promotion, I'll give you training, I'll give you opportunity if you do me a sexual favor. So this for that, that's what we mean by quid pro quo sexual harassment. The other is a creating of a hostile working environment. So we can break it into various categories, right? But I'll just give you examples so it's easy for people to understand. So a hostile working environment would be where I would be commenting on your physical appearance, what you're wearing, your sexual orientation, your sexual activities. So I'm commenting on these, or I'm making double meaning jokes, which makes you feel uncomfortable. So how you know whether the work environment is hostile or toxic is, does it make you feel uncomfortable, right? So the first thing is that you just ask from yourself, does it make me feel uncomfortable? The other is, would you be okay if this kind of behavior happened to your loved ones? If you answer these two questions, does it make me feel uncomfortable, or would I be comfortable if this happened to a loved one, is going to tell you your gut reaction to this behavior. And that's going to tell you, oh no, this behavior is toxic. Right. I don't like it. I don't welcome it. Right. So that's in a very in a practical way, that's a way to approach it. So if you have a culture like that, you need employees, like we always say, harassment and violence in a work setting always happen, at least the first occurrence, in a public setting. So there are other people looking on, right? We call these like bystanders or onlookers, or you can name them whatever you like. But we have these people looking on. So when people are looking on in this manner, what we want our employees to do is to react. So generally there are 4 ways that people react. You have this very classic approach of, I see nothing, I hear nothing. This is nothing to do with me, it's to do with these 2 people. The other is, I'm a spectator. I egg on for that behavior to happen. I also make comments. I also laugh at that joke that's happening. So I am becoming a spectator. Like, imagine like when we go to a cricket match or any kind of sporting event, you know, the spectator kind of behavior that we do, right? So that's also another very toxic thing to do. So the first 2 that I told you are very toxic. We pretend like I hear nothing, I see nothing, it's not my problem. Or the other is, I'm a spectator, I'm egging this on. I'm encouraging this behavior to happen. The other that we really want is to create people who are observers. Observers are people who just observe what is happening. And I always encourage people to ask 2 questions from yourself. Would you like it if it happened to you? Would you like it if it happened to your loved one? That's really going to tell you whether this behavior is acceptable or not to you. And then you know, okay, as an observer, I have choices here. And what are my choices, right? So my choices is that I can intervene. But how do I intervene? So this is where we need the management to help people to, how do we intervene? You have trainings for that. How do I intervene? I can intervene when the situation is occurring. I can also intervene after the incident has happened. It doesn't, but the intervention doesn't have to be hostile. It doesn't have to be like a angry response, right? It can be somewhere where you take the spotlight away from the person who's being attacked, right? You can move the conversation along, and you can also simply, after the incident has happened, there are ways you can approach the person. If that person was a peer, you can definitely approach and say, look, I saw you doing this behavior, I think it's wrong. Or if it's a supervisor and you don't have that capacity to directly go and speak, then you have various other intervention methods where you first go and talk to a contact person, and that contact person is going to help you a way to approach that person and speak, or the contact person will be the person who will go and speak with the supervisor. So there are ways of intervening. It can be whilst the incident is happening, or also after. So this is something that observers or onlookers can do. That's why I always tell you, as much as the management has responsibilities, so do all the other employees, because you're watching on. You have a responsibility. And what is that responsibility? The other is, now you've done your part, you've intervened. Can you be a witness? So you're an observer. Now you're transitioning from observer who intervened to a witness. So a witness is a person who comes forward when we are having formal inquiries or even informal inquiries, who comes and say, look, this incident happened. I saw the impact it had on A. A was feeling very uncomfortable. A was like, after the incident, A was not engaging with the team. A was looking down. A went to the washroom. A was afterwards not with us. She was not responding. He or she was not responding. And also saying, yes, I heard this and this is what the conversation is about, or I saw this happen. So there are always two parties. You have the management and you have the employees, and both of these people who make up this ecosystem needs to come together to kind of make a positive impact on combating these toxic or unhealthy work practices.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to add was what Simran was talking about before, that when we talk about workplace accountability or toxic workplace culture, first of all, it's very important to define what constitutes as a workplace. Because one of the issues that we have with harassment is that people think of workplace as a very physical space, even now, even in the post-COVID world. So toxic behavior that takes place outside of your cubicle or your flow, things that happen in the elevator, things that happen in the cafeteria, things that happen in your work transport, those things are overlooked. So when we talk about a toxic workplace or what are the traits of a toxic workplace, the easiest way to define it is to think of the opposite. What is a healthy workspace?
Right.
Because when you identify the traits or components of a healthy workplace, a toxic workplace is basically the absence of those components, right? It's not that people are bad, it's that they lack good values or healthy, and one of the main things is that not understanding that the workplace goes beyond your cubicle, that you can't just for example, you might be polite and friendly in the workplace, but if you go home and harass your colleagues on Facebook, or if you keep texting them on WhatsApp, or if you spam the group chat with insensitive material, that's still toxic workplace culture, because your workplace has given you that sense of entitlement where you feel like I can treat my colleagues however I want. And also another one is that what you were talking about before, Blessy, in the sense that when it comes to reporting an HR, we have, recently and also before, we've had incidents where people call people out on social media because they feel like it's safer for them to do that than to do it in person. But what is interesting is that when that happens, people get called out for calling out, saying, why are you doing this? Why are you making a scene on social media? And then a common question that I get a lot when we do sessions is that, is it okay to call people out on social media? Because are we, being a bad person? Are we being one of the bullies? I think in those situations, the most important thing to focus on is the fact that why did that person feel like they had to take this to the social media?
Right.
Because obviously they have been failed by institutions and mechanisms that were supposed to support them in the first place. If that person was able to go to HR and figure this out, if that person was able to go to the police station and figure this out, they wouldn't be doing this on Facebook or on Twitter. There won't be a need. So we need to understand that a toxic workplace is something that lets you down, something that feels like it won't support you. And I think like we discussed in the previous session also, it has a lot to do with how you feel, because the way you define an environment is based on how it makes you feel. And a healthy workplace or a positive workplace makes you feel safe. For me, that's the most important component. If your workspace feels unsafe, then that's a huge red flag. Because if you walk into your workplace and think, oh, what's going to happen today?
Right.
Or if you think, I can't wait to go home, that's a concern, right?
Yeah.
That's a concern. And also the fact that if it makes you feel uncomfortable, if it makes you feel like intimidated or even isolated, those are some, emotions or feelings that we need to focus on. And those are feelings that we kind of overlook, because the only emotion or quality that we associate with the workplace is productivity. Did I get my work done? Did I do my job? How many reports did I write? How many things did I create? It's what we associate. If I did a lot of good work, it means I had a good day. But that's not always the case, right? Productivity does not always translate into a healthy workplace. Not for everyone. So that's something that we need to think about.
Yeah.
And in terms of holding the workplace accountable, I think, yes, Gaina was absolutely right. It's a combined effort. You can't just fix one side and expect it to just, work out. But I think the responsibility should start with leadership within the organization, and not just higher management per se, right? Even people like team leaders. Because what we've realized when training employees or working with employees is that, especially with our culture, in the South Asian or Sri Lankan culture, we have a tendency to value hierarchies, at least subconsciously, right? We have a tendency to value power. It's kind of like, an intrinsic thing. And what happens is, when people have more power than us, especially in the workplace, corporate power, institutional power, we tend to look at them as role models, and that can either go very well or horribly wrong. Because that's why when we do, sensitization or trainings, we always say leaders need to lead by example. They need to do it so that people look at it and realize, okay, so the person who is leading me is doing it, so it's my responsibility to do it as well. But often what happens is the other way around, because when someone you look up to and someone you respect does something unhealthy or something toxic or something awful, you feel like that act is justified.
Right.
Because if this person does it, then so can I. So you justify that behavior, you justify your own kind of entitlement. So I think focusing on leadership during, building healthy, safe workspaces is very important, because they need to be held accountable, because they, the whole, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
That's
they set the pace too.
Yeah.
Can I ask Dharini, just a question? So, in an instance where someone feels unsafe at work or is being bullied and has then gone and made this complaint to HR or someone in power, and their mode of investigation would be to bring in the perpetrator and the victim into the same room and then discuss the problems, and also call in someone else who, like Gaini said, is a witness, or sorry, is a spectator,
bystander.
someone who has been, joining in on the bullying. And that is the form of investigation. Wouldn't I be able to hold the company accountable for completely letting me down then?
Of course, of course. And even things like, in some instances, of course, we've had dealt with cases where the harassment is just out on the charts, right? It's awful. And the fact that the victim has to be in the same room as the person who harassed them is awful.
Yeah.
In those situations, Dinasha, I think what is important is for the victim to be able to say, I don't feel comfortable in doing this, because the purpose of the investigation is to help the victim. It's not to figure out a case. It's not to figure out, oh, we did justice, we figured out something, violence has ended, yay. It's to make sure someone has been wronged. How do we support them? How do we make them feel safe again? But if the process itself is going to re-victimize that person, then that's where the fault lies. And this is a problem that we have with our existing legal system as well, where you go to the police to make a complaint, and the questions they ask you makes you feel more violated, even more than before. So I think in terms of course, organizations already have policies and structures in place where they say this is how we analyze a case, this is how the investigation takes place, but they need to be accountable for how it takes place and how the investigation impacts the victim, because it does not impact everyone in the same way. And if it has a negative effect on the victim, that person should be able to talk about it. For example, when working with different companies, I always look into the policy and see, okay, what does it say? And one of my favorite things about any policy, or what I think should be definitely there, is the component where it says, if there is any retaliation after making a complaint, we will make sure that it will not be tolerated. Because I feel that is a huge sense of comfort for the victim, because one of the biggest concerns in reporting an incident is retaliation, not just from the perpetrator, but from the company as a whole, from your colleagues, from your team, because some people just think it's wrong to complain. Other people judge the person saying, okay, you must have done something wrong. Or other people say, okay, why are you making a scene? This is something we all go through. Can't you just not make this a big thing?
Deal.
Yeah, exactly. So that is, again, a process of re-victimizing that person. So those things should not be tolerated, and the company should hold itself accountable for that. So of course, putting it in the policy itself is very important, saying, this is something that we will protect you from. And of course, saying that is not enough, you need to practice it as well. So definitely, I think in terms of, an investigation or an incident of such nature, it's very important to focus on the victim, not just on the incident, because it's important to understand they're two separate things, right? So that's something I feel a lot of people forget when they are handling a case of harassment, especially in the workplace.
In the interest of employers, there is obviously an impact of a work environment that isn't conducive to productivity as a result of harassment that maybe common knowledge may not be, but one way or the other, it's going to impact the productivity. And I think this is something that corporations, small organizations, startups, constituting of 2 employees or hundreds, that whether they like it or not, harassment in any form is going to impact their productivity. So Simran, maybe you could kind of enlighten us on just how it does impact companies when it comes to the productivity if they don't address issues like harassment in the workplace.
Yeah, indeed. I think this was really the selling point when they were negotiating the standard in particular, was the argument, especially from an employer's perspective, of how harassment and violence actually do affect productivity. And when they looked at it from that lens, actually, it was made a lot more sense.
Surprise.
Yeah, because I mean, there are, I'm not a psychologist, but we know what happens when people are in this toxic environment. You have absenteeism. You have, because you could be sick or you're just not feeling up to speed. You don't feel safe walking from point A to point B that you need to do to, if it's a factory assembly line, because you're being harassed. So there are a lot of different ways in which this manifests itself, but really first and foremost is psychological and absenteeism and things like that you get. So definitely this issue needs to be looked at from a lens of also productivity, but at the same time also the rights of the workers and the employers to be operating in a safe space, safe environment. Someone, I think Dharani also mentioned, startups, or you mentioned also these small workplaces. These days, this is a dimension that hasn't been looked at as much. The home has become the workplace. And here in Sri Lanka, a lot of enterprises are actually home-based, that employ less than 10 employees, maybe even just 5. And they're operating in the informal economy. So informal sector, so they're not technically as well protected under law as well. And you have a dimension that has not been looked at very much so, which is the impact that a lot of these enterprises also suffer from cases of domestic violence. And how does domestic violence actually interact with the world of work? And you find many times that when you look at the corporate sector or the different policies across organizations, it doesn't actually take into account whether the employees or even the business owner, for that matter, is a victim of violence. So I think that's something that is very important that we should be also looking at. So when there's a occupational health risk assessment, it shouldn't just look at the physical spaces and say, okay, this fan, there's not enough ventilation. It actually needs to be nuanced enough and informed enough to pick up on these psychological elements and the kind of harm that is taking place also as a result of domestic violence that could very well be exacerbated. We know with COVID, there were a lot of incidences of domestic violence reported and an increase. And that's reflective of the fact that many workplaces are within homes. Right. And so when you're cooped up on top of that, it makes it a lot more. So certainly this new standard that I talked about actually also really does call on member states to also look at this issue of domestic violence when they are coming up with prevention, protection measures, training, guidelines, and the kind of remedial action, whether it's by efficient law enforcement mechanisms, etc. So we need to feature that as well.
I think I would say that what we are looking at when we're trying to address violence and harassment at the workplace is we are trying to alter culture. And as Dharini pointed out, in Sri Lanka, there are lots of issues in terms of how we react to people in power, and also in terms of how bullying is a part of our culture as well. You see that how, that's the way we kind of interact. We bully people, and then sometimes the bullying stops being camaraderie and it becomes bullying, right? And where does that shift happen? So I think what's important to keep in mind is that we are trying to alter culture, and that culture doesn't change overnight or with the snap of your fingers or just by having a policy or reporting mechanisms or trainings. It just doesn't change overnight. Culture changes. I think I read this somewhere and it really stuck in my mind, and it says that culture changes one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, and one good decision at a time. So that means it takes a lot of time, and it also takes consistency. So that is really the approach when it comes to addressing violence and harassment. If you have to be consistent with your approach, consistent with your training, and you have to keep at it.
Just to add to that, in terms of our discussion on creating workplaces that are healthy or reducing toxic behavior in the workplace, I think regardless of whether it's a corporate sector or public sector, whatever it is, I think a lot of companies need to focus on core human values, because while it is important to have policies, while it's important to have trainings, while it's important to have productivity and profit, at the end of the day, any space it becomes safer or more dignified when there is more respect and when there is more empathy. And that is something that we lack as society. That's not a workplace problem. That's a that's a Sri Lankan problem. Yeah, that's been there. And we need to be able to understand, either we have to learn it through trainings, or we should be able to self-actualize how the lack of these values contribute towards a toxic culture. For example, the lack of empathy itself, if we were a little bit more empathetic, I feel like a lot of the issues would go down. So what we were talking about before, how I can't go and make a complaint because there are no women in the complaining committee. Ideally, it shouldn't be a problem, right? In an ideal world, because you don't have to be a woman in order to sympathize or empathize with another person's burden.
Right.
And we've seen that a lot of victims or survivors of gender-based violence come to us and say, I can't talk to my boss, he's a man, he won't understand. Why doesn't he understand is the problem. You don't need to have a vagina to know that,
pretty much
harassment starts. It's a problem of empathy, it's a problem of consent, it's a problem of respect. So I think normalizing these conversations in the workplace is very important, where if you feel like someone is being disrespectful, someone is being unempathetic, someone is violating your consent, you should be able to talk about it, not just when harassment happens, right? In general, normalizing these conversations where you are able to talk about your feelings, where you're able to talk about your boundaries, is a very everyday thing. So when, if and when something happens, you don't feel overwhelmed by it. You just speak out and it's accepted, and you are in a circle where you're trusted, where you're supported, instead of being judged and ridiculed for it. So I think definitely moving forward, regardless of the environment, whether it's the home environment, whether it's the work environment or schools, having more conversations on creating empathetic spaces and respectful spaces is definitely something we all need to work on.
Amen.
So from my side, I think, there's a three-pronged, if I were to summarize, approach that should be followed when it comes to this. I mean, the first and foremost is defining what is meant by harassment and violence, sexual, economic violence and harassment, so physical. So there are many different dimensions, psychological, virtual, of what it is. And so defining it is really, really crucial. And that is important in terms of trying to create a culture of prevention and protection, because that is where we often fall behind. We tend to think that this is important in terms of law enforcement, remedial actions, punitive actions, but actually you go much further if you clearly define what this is and what it means and how you can put in place measures to prevent and protect particularly those groups or sectors or occupations that you know are particularly prone to violence and harassment. So that's the first, prevention and protection. The second, of course, is certainly there should be measures, enforcement measures in place that are victim centric and friendly, but also the kind of remedies in place, whether it's counseling, it should be confidential, etc. So those kind of, in a protection against retaliation, we talked about that. So the enforcement and remedy side is also equally and just as important. Very importantly also was touched on, which is this issue of guidance and training. So whether it's to create a workplace culture that's empathetic and understanding, but it's really important that, both employers, employees, contractors, whoever else is interacting in that work setting is really also very much aware of what the definition means and what the steps are, what can be taken, and how to behave, what protocols to follow in terms of actions. So protection, prevention, guidance, and training, and of course, enforcement and remedies. So those are the three areas. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies, for broadening our knowledge on HR policies in Sri Lanka. And basically, what we wanted to do with this panel discussion is to make everyone who's tuned in feel protected and feel safe in your workplace. So if you need any further information on it, any further guidance, Women in Media is always here to help. Blessy, I think you can tell them how they can get in touch with the group. Thanks, Hani, Dharani, Simran. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Just to wrap things up again, remember this is the second session of the series that we've been doing on sexual harassment, this time focusing on HR policy and what can be done, things to look out for in your workplace that may or may not contribute to, a toxic workplace environment. Once again, would like to thank all of you guys that are tuned in, all of the wonderful women we had on our panel, also the Vinyl Cafe for hosting the live stream over here, as well as Vijay Newspapers, Daily Mirror, and Pulse for sharing the video. There's one more session to come, which we'll be getting into. But in the meantime, if you would like to connect and you have questions about any of the things that we talked about, you can direct them to our email, which is womeninmedialk@gmail.com. Have a great rest of the day.